The royal healers had failed, and the Alpha King's pup had only hours left. The words spread through the palace like a winter storm, carried by frightened whispers and trembling voices. Outside, snow fell heavily across the kingdom, covering rooftops, gardens, and stone pathways beneath a blanket of white. Inside the royal palace, however, nobody noticed the beauty of the season. Fear had settled over every hallway. Servants moved quickly through candlelit corridors. Guards stood unusually tense at their posts. Advisors spoke in hushed voices as though speaking too loudly might somehow make the situation worse. At the center of it all, deep within the royal residence, a small child lay motionless beneath layers of blankets. The Alpha King's young son had been fighting a mysterious illness for days. At first, everyone believed it would pass. Then came the fever, then the weakness, then the frightening silence that followed when the child no longer had the strength to leave his bed. Every healer in the kingdom had been summoned. Some traveled hundreds of miles through snow and ice to reach the palace. They arrived carrying rare medicines, ancient books, and generations of knowledge. One by one, they examined the young pup. One by one, they failed. None could explain why the child continued to weaken. None could stop it. None could offer hope. In the royal chamber, the Alpha King stood beside the bed, his broad shoulders rigid with exhaustion. He had not slept properly in days. His dark coat hung heavily across his frame, and shadows rested beneath his eyes. Advisors continued bringing reports and recommendations, but he barely heard them anymore. His attention never left his son. Every shallow breath from the child seemed louder than the winter wind outside. Every passing hour felt like a battle he could not win. For a ruler accustomed to solving problems and protecting his people, helplessness felt unbearable. Nearby, another healer quietly packed away his supplies. The older man lowered his gaze before speaking. "Your Majesty, I am sorry." The room fell silent. No one needed further explanation. It was the same answer they had heard again and again. The Alpha King closed his eyes briefly. Around him, members of the royal council exchanged worried glances. Some had already begun preparing for the possibility nobody wished to discuss aloud. Outside the chamber, servants wiped tears from their eyes. The young pup was beloved throughout the palace. Even people who had only met him once remembered his bright smile and endless curiosity. Nobody wanted to imagine the kingdom without him. As darkness settled across the snow-covered capital, bells rang from distant towers, marking another passing hour. The sound echoed through the palace like a countdown. Hope was fading. Confidence was disappearing. Yet far beyond the royal wing, near the outer gardens where few nobles ever visited, a young Omega quietly finished her work among rows of winter herbs. She had no wolf, no title, no importance in the eyes of the kingdom. And at that very moment, she had no idea that fate was already moving her toward a child everyone else had given up on. Claire Parker lived in a small stone cottage tucked behind the palace greenhouses where few nobles ever bothered to visit. Every morning before sunrise, she crossed snow-covered pathways carrying baskets, pruning shears, and worn gardening gloves. While the rest of the palace focused on politics, ceremonies, and power, Claire spent her days caring for herbs. Lavender, winter sage, silverroot, moonleaf, and dozens of other medicinal plants filled the greenhouse beds she maintained with patient devotion. The work was simple, but she loved it. Plants never judged her. They never whispered when she entered a room. They never looked disappointed when they learned she was a wolfless Omega. A cold wind swept across the gardens as Claire carefully brushed snow from a row of protected herbs growing beneath glass panels. Her blonde hair escaped from beneath her wool hood, catching strands of pale winter sunlight. Nearby, two palace workers pushed a cart loaded with supplies. As they passed, their conversation drifted toward her. "They say another healer failed this morning." The second man sighed. "That makes 12. Poor child." Their voices faded as they continued down the path. Claire lowered her eyes toward the plants. Like everyone else in the palace, she had heard the rumors. The Alpha King's son was still ill. Some servants claimed the fever had worsened. Others whispered that the royal healers had already exhausted every treatment they knew. No one seemed certain about anything except one fact. The kingdom was running out of hope. Claire gently touched a cluster of winter mint leaves. She knew a little about healing. Not enough to call herself a healer, but enough to understand the properties of many plants. Her late grandmother had taught her everything she knew. While other children learned pack traditions and wolf history, Claire spent afternoons learning how roots, leaves, and flowers could help people recover from illness. Those lessons had remained with her long after her grandmother was gone. Unfortunately, few people cared about such knowledge when it came from a wolfless omega. Later that afternoon, Claire carried fresh herbs toward the palace kitchens. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than usual. Servants spoke quietly. Several looked worried. Even the cooks who normally joked throughout the day seemed distracted. As Claire entered through a side doorway, she noticed a group gathered around a palace physician. The older man appeared exhausted. "Nothing is working," someone whispered. Claire slowed her steps. The physician shook his head. "The symptoms make no sense. Every remedy fails." A knot formed in Claire's stomach. She continued walking, but the conversation stayed with her. Something about it bothered her. Not because she believed she could solve the problem. She did not. Yet her grandmother had always taught her that when symptoms made no sense, people were often looking in the wrong place. As evening approached, snow began falling again. Claire returned to the greenhouse to close vents and secured delicate plants against the cold. The glass walls glowed softly beneath lantern light. Outside, the palace towers rose against the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond those walls, a frightened father sat beside his sick child. Claire paused for a moment, watching snowflakes drift through the night. She could not explain why, but she suddenly felt certain that this story was not over. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice told her that the answer everyone was searching for had not yet been found. The next morning arrived beneath a gray sky heavy with snow. Claire woke before dawn as she always did, and stepped into the greenhouse while the world was still quiet. Frost covered the glass walls in delicate patterns that shimmered beneath lantern light. She moved between rows of herbs, checking leaves and roots with practiced hands. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversations she had overheard. The child was still ill. Another healer had failed. Another day had passed without answers. By mid-morning, the palace seemed even more unsettled than before. Messengers hurried across courtyards. Stable hands prepared horses for arriving visitors. More healers had been summoned from distant territories. Claire carried a basket of freshly harvested herbs toward the kitchens and noticed several servants gathered near a side corridor. Their faces were pale. "The fever returned during the night," one whispered. "They say he barely touched any food." Another servant shook her head sadly. "The Alpha King has not left his son's room for more than a few minutes at a time." Claire continued walking, but concern settled heavily in her chest. She knew enough about illness to understand that exhaustion often caused people to overlook important details. When everyone focused on dramatic symptoms, they sometimes missed the smaller clues hiding beneath them. Later that afternoon, a shipment of rare plants arrived for the royal healers. Because Claire managed much of the palace greenhouse inventory, she was asked to help organize the delivery. Wooden crates filled with medicinal roots, flowers, and leaves lined a storage room near the healer's wing. As she carefully sorted each item, she noticed a familiar scent drifting from one of the containers. Her hands paused. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside rested several decorative branches covered with small silver leaves. Claire frowned immediately. She recognized the plant. It was commonly used in wealthy homes because of its beautiful appearance. Most people considered it harmless. Her grandmother had taught her otherwise. In enclosed spaces, prolonged exposure could sometimes trigger unusual reactions in children and individuals with heightened sensitivity. The symptoms varied: fatigue, loss of appetite, persistent weakness, sometimes fever-like conditions. Claire stared at the branches. A memory surfaced. Several weeks earlier, she had seen similar decorations being carried toward the royal residence as part of a winter display. Her pulse quickened slightly. The possibility seemed almost absurd. Surely the royal healers had already considered every environmental factor. Surely they had inspected the room. Yet the uncomfortable feeling remained. After finishing her work, Claire found herself walking past the healer's wing. Through an open doorway, she caught a glimpse of several physicians discussing treatments around a long table covered with notes. None appeared hopeful. One man rubbed his forehead in frustration. Another simply stared at the floor. For a moment, Claire considered speaking. The thought vanished almost instantly. Who would listen to a wolfless Omega gardener when the greatest healers in the kingdom were already involved? She lowered her gaze and continued walking. Even so, the image of those silver leaves refused to leave her mind. That evening, as snow drifted across the palace grounds once again, Claire stood alone inside the greenhouse, staring at a sample of the same plant growing near the back wall. Her grandmother's words echoed softly through memory. Sometimes the answer everyone seeks is hiding in plain sight, because nobody believes it could be that simple. Claire looked toward the distant palace towers glowing against the winter darkness. Somewhere beyond those walls, a child still suffered. And for the first time, she began wondering whether remaining silent might be the greater mistake. The following morning, Claire made her decision. Snow covered the palace grounds beneath a pale gray sky as she walked toward the healer's wing, carrying a small bundle of notes tucked beneath her coat. With every step, doubt pressed against her confidence. She was not a healer. She held no title. She possessed no wolf. Yet the image of those silver leaves continued to haunt her thoughts. By the time she reached the stone corridor outside the treatment chambers, her hands felt cold despite the warmth inside the building. Several healers were gathered around a table reviewing reports. Their expressions ranged from exhausted to frustrated. Claire hesitated near the doorway before finally speaking. "Excuse me." The conversation stopped. A few heads turned. One healer looked genuinely confused. "Can we help you?" Claire swallowed carefully. "I think there may be something you have overlooked." The room grew quiet. Encouraged by the silence, she continued. "The decorative silverleaf branches placed throughout the royal residence. Have they been removed from the child's room?" Several healers exchanged puzzled glances. One older physician frowned. "Silverleaf." Claire nodded. "Prolonged exposure can sometimes affect children with heightened sensitivities. The symptoms can resemble illness." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a younger healer laughed softly. Not cruelly. Dismissively. "You believe decorative plants are responsible for this?" Another healer shook his head. "We are dealing with a far more complex situation." Heat rose into Claire's cheeks. Still, she remained calm. "I understand. I only thought it was worth considering." The older physician sighed. "And where exactly did you receive this medical education?" Claire recognized the question for what it was. Not curiosity. Judgment. "My grandmother taught me herbal medicine." Several expressions immediately hardened. The room seemed to lose interest all at once. A wolfless Omega gardener. The explanation alone was enough for many of them. One healer returned to his notes. Another turned away entirely. "Thank you for your concern," the older physician said politely. "But we have already explored every realistic possibility." The conversation was over. Claire stood there for another second before quietly nodding. "Of course." She left without another word. Outside, the cold air stung her face. Embarrassment settled heavily in her chest. She should have expected that reaction. Yet disappointment lingered anyway. Not for herself. For the child still lying in that room while everyone searched for answers. The rest of the day passed slowly. Claire returned to the greenhouse and focused on her work, but concentration proved impossible. Every time she trimmed a plant or watered a root bed, her thoughts drifted back to the healer's wing. As evening approached, a palace servant arrived carrying fresh supplies for the gardens. The woman looked exhausted. "Any improvement?" Claire asked quietly. The servant lowered her eyes. "No." The single word felt heavier than the winter sky above them. Claire watched the woman disappear down the path before turning toward the palace. Lanterns glowed from hundreds of windows. Somewhere inside, the Alpha King remained beside his son. Somewhere inside, hope continued slipping away. Claire tightened her grip around the gardening shears in her hand. She had spoken once and been ignored. Yet deep inside, the feeling remained unchanged. Something was wrong. Something everyone else had missed. And as darkness settled across the kingdom, fate quietly moved closer to giving her a second chance to be heard. The second chance arrived sooner than Claire expected. Before sunrise the following morning, urgent bells echoed across the palace grounds. Their sound cut through the falling snow and carried all the way to the greenhouse. Claire looked up from a tray of winter herbs, her heart immediately sinking. Something had happened. By mid-morning, the entire palace seemed consumed by anxiety. Servants moved quickly through corridors. Messengers rushed between wings of the royal residence. Even the guards appeared uneasy. Claire overheard fragments of conversation wherever she went. The child's condition had worsened overnight. Another treatment had failed. Time was running out. The words followed her throughout the day. Near noon, she was delivering fresh herbs to the kitchen when she noticed several members of the royal council hurrying toward the main residence. Their faces were grim. Behind them walked two healers carrying cases filled with medicines. Neither looked confident. Claire stopped beside a window overlooking the inner courtyard. Snow swirled through the air as people hurried back and forth below. The entire palace seemed trapped in a storm of fear and uncertainty. She thought about returning to her greenhouse and forgetting everything. After all, she had already spoken once. Nobody had listened. Yet the image of those silverleaf branches continued to haunt her thoughts. The symptoms, the timing, the location, none of it felt accidental. Her grandmother had always taught her that knowledge meant little if fear prevented someone from using it. Claire stood silently for several moments before making a decision. This time, she would not speak to the healers. She would speak directly to the only person who still had the authority to act. Reaching the royal residence proved more difficult than she expected. Several guards stopped her long before she reached the upper halls. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief when she explained why she was there. "You wish to speak with the Alpha King?" one asked. Claire nodded. The guard exchanged a glance with his companion. Neither looked convinced. "His Majesty is occupied." Claire expected that answer. "I understand, but I believe I may have information that could help his son." The guards hesitated. One almost smiled. Not out of kindness, out of disbelief. A gardener, a wolfless Omega, claiming she might help where the kingdom's greatest healers had failed. Yet before either guard could dismiss her completely, a palace steward emerged from a nearby corridor. The older man recognized Claire from the greenhouse operations and paused long enough to hear the conversation. Something in her voice must have convinced him. Perhaps it was determination. Perhaps desperation. Whatever the reason, he eventually nodded. "Wait here." Nearly 30 minutes passed. Claire stood alone in the corridor listening to distant footsteps and muffled voices. Every second felt longer than the last. Then the steward returned. His expression was impossible to read. "His Majesty will grant you 5 minutes." Claire's breath caught. Moments later, enormous doors opened before her. Warm light spilled into the hallway. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy with exhaustion. Advisors stood quietly along the walls. Several healers remained nearby. At the far side of the room stood the Alpha King himself. He looked older than he had only days before. Worry and sleepless nights had carved deep shadows beneath his eyes. Yet despite everything weighing upon him, his attention shifted toward Claire the moment she entered. For the first time in her life, the most powerful man in the kingdom was looking directly at her. And as silence settled across the room, Claire realized this was the moment that could change everything. Claire felt every eye in the room settle on her. Advisors studied her with confusion. The healers looked openly skeptical. One of them immediately recognized her from the previous day and frowned. Yet none of them mattered at that moment. Only the Alpha King did. He stood beside his son's bed, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of countless sleepless hours. "You asked to see me." Claire nodded. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Alpha King waited. Claire took a careful breath. "I believe there is something inside the royal residence contributing to the illness." Several healers exchanged irritated glances. One immediately stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this is exactly the theory she mentioned before." Another shook his head. "We have already examined every reasonable explanation." Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks, but forced herself to continue. "I understand, but I am asking you to consider one possibility." The Alpha King remained silent. Unlike the others, he did not interrupt. Claire pointed toward the decorative arrangements displayed throughout the chamber. Silverleaf branches stood in elegant vases beside windows, doorways, and even near the child's bed. Those plants. The room fell quiet. One healer sighed heavily. Another looked ready to object. The Alpha King raised a hand. Instantly, everyone stopped talking. His attention returned to Claire. "Explain." Encouraged, she stepped closer. "My grandmother taught herbal medicine. Silverleaf is beautiful, but some children react badly to prolonged exposure, especially in enclosed spaces during winter when windows remain closed. Fatigue, weakness, appetite loss, persistent fever-like symptoms. Not everyone experiences it, but those who do can become seriously ill over time. One physician shook his head. This illness is far too severe for that. Claire met his gaze. Perhaps, but if there is even a small chance, removing the plants costs nothing. Silence followed. The Alpha King looked toward the silverleaf arrangements positioned throughout the room. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then he made a decision. Remove every branch. Several healers appeared startled. One opened his mouth to protest before quickly thinking better of it. Servants immediately moved through the room, gathering decorations. Within minutes, every trace of silverleaf had disappeared. The Alpha King looked back at Claire. What else? The question surprised everyone, including her. Claire glanced toward the child. His face appeared pale beneath the blankets. Fresh air whenever possible. Simpler meals. Water. Rest. Nothing complicated. A healer almost laughed. Years of training, rare medicines, and complicated treatments reduced to simple care. Yet the Alpha King did not dismiss her. Perhaps desperation left him willing to try anything. Or perhaps he simply recognized sincerity when he heard it. Very well, he said quietly. As the afternoon passed, Claire remained nearby answering questions whenever asked. Most healers ignored her. A few watched her with open annoyance. Yet hours later, something changed. It was small. So small that many people might have missed it. The child accepted a few bites of food for the first time in days. One servant noticed. Then another. By evening, the atmosphere inside the chamber felt slightly different. Not hopeful. Not yet. But different. The Alpha King sat beside the bed watching every detail with careful attention. When the child finished drinking water without difficulty, relief briefly softened the ruler's exhausted expression. Claire noticed it immediately. For the first time since entering the room, she saw something other than fear in his eyes. And as snow continued falling beyond the palace windows, the impossible no longer felt quite so impossible. Morning arrived quietly. For the first time in many days, the atmosphere inside the royal residence felt different. The change was subtle, almost fragile, like the first ray of sunlight after a long winter storm. Claire entered the treatment chamber carrying a small basket of fresh herbs recommended to help create a calmer environment. She expected tension. She expected doubt. Instead, she found cautious anticipation. Several servants stood near the doorway whispering among themselves. Their worried expressions had softened. One of them noticed Claire and offered a small smile. It was the first smile anyone had given her since this began. Claire glanced toward the bed. The young pup was awake. The sight stopped her in place. He was still pale, still weak, but his eyes were open. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows and reflected softly across the blankets as the child quietly watched snowflakes drifting outside. Nearby, the Alpha King sat beside him. Exhaustion remained visible in every line of his face, yet something new had appeared there as well. Hope. The ruler looked up when Claire entered. For a moment their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but the gratitude in his expression was impossible to miss. Across the room, several healers carefully reviewed notes. Their conversations sounded very different from the confident discussions Claire had overheard days earlier. Now they were searching for explanations, comparing observations, re-examining assumptions. One older physician approached the bed and performed another examination. When he finished, his brow furrowed. The fever continues to decline. Another healer nodded slowly. His appetite is improving as well. A third physician looked toward the windows where fresh winter air now circulated through slightly open panels. The symptoms changed shortly after the environmental adjustments. Silence followed. Nobody needed to explain what that meant. Claire remained near the back of the room. She had no desire for attention. She only cared about the child. The young pup noticed her standing there and offered a faint smile. "Are you the gardener?" he asked softly. Claire smiled back. "I am. The flowers outside my window are yours." The simple statement warmed her heart. "Some of them are." The child looked pleased by that answer. The Alpha King watched the exchange quietly. Hours passed. More signs of recovery appeared. The child asked for food twice. He sat up without assistance. His voice grew stronger. By afternoon, word had spread throughout the palace. Servants carried the news from hallway to hallway. Guards shared updates at their posts. Hope moved through the kingdom faster than fear ever had. Meanwhile, The healers finally returned to the question they had dismissed. Samples of silverleaf were brought in for study. Records were reviewed. Observations were compared. The evidence became impossible to ignore. The plant had indeed contributed to the condition. Not through malice. Not through magic. Through a simple factor nobody had considered. Late that evening, one of the senior physicians approached Claire personally. The older man looked uncomfortable. "It appears your assessment was correct." Claire blinked in surprise. The apology that followed seemed difficult for him to deliver. "We should have listened sooner." Claire simply nodded. There was no satisfaction in being right. Only relief. Across the chamber, the Alpha King stood beside his recovering son while golden light from the fireplace illuminated the room. For the first time since this ordeal began, the future no longer felt uncertain. And as snow continued falling gently beyond the palace walls, an entire kingdom began to realize that the person who saved its beloved pup was the very person it had spent years overlooking. The palace felt transformed over the next several days. Where fear had once lingered in every corridor, cautious optimism now followed the sound of footsteps and conversation. Servants smiled more often. Advisors spoke with less tension. Even the winter light streaming through the palace windows seemed warmer somehow. The young pup continued to recover, gaining strength with each passing day. He spent time sitting beside the fireplace, reading books, and watching snow drift across the gardens beyond the glass. Every small improvement became a source of celebration throughout the kingdom. Yet while everyone spoke about the recovery, another conversation quietly began spreading through the palace. People were asking the same question. Who was the Omega who had succeeded where the greatest healers had failed? Claire did her best to avoid the attention. Each morning she returned to the greenhouse before sunrise and focused on her plants. The familiar routine brought comfort. She watered seedlings, trimmed winter herbs, and organized supplies exactly as she always had. Still, something had changed. Palace workers who once walked past her without a glance now greeted her warmly. Guards nodded respectfully when she passed through the courtyards. Even some of the healers who had dismissed her began stopping to ask questions about medicinal plants. The attention felt strange. Claire never knew quite how to respond. One afternoon, while she carefully repotted several young moonleaf plants, a royal steward arrived unexpectedly. "His Majesty wishes to speak with you," he said. Claire nearly dropped the gardening tools in her hands. Minutes later, she found herself walking through the palace once again. This time the journey felt very different. Nobody questioned her presence. Nobody tried to turn her away. When she entered a private sitting room overlooking the snow-covered gardens, she found the Alpha King standing beside a tall window. The winter sun illuminated the room with soft golden light. For a moment neither spoke. Then the Alpha King turned toward her. He looked rested for the first time since she had met him. Relief had replaced much of the exhaustion that once shadowed his expression. "My son asked about you this morning," he said. Claire blinked in surprise. "He did." A small smile appeared on the ruler's face. He wanted to know whether the gardener who helped him would visit again. Warmth spread through Claire's chest. The Alpha King studied her quietly before speaking once more. "I have also been learning more about you." Claire looked down instinctively. "There is not much to learn, Your Majesty." "I disagree." His voice remained calm. "I discovered that you have spent years caring for the palace gardens. I learned that many of the medicinal herbs used throughout the kingdom come from plants you cultivated. I learned that your grandmother was respected for her knowledge." Claire said nothing. The Alpha King continued. "I also learned how often people overlooked you." The room fell silent. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. There was no anger in his voice, only understanding. For the first time in a very long time, someone had taken the time to see her entire story instead of judging her by a single label. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted slowly across the garden she loved. Inside, something equally important was beginning to change. The Alpha King was no longer simply grateful to the Omega who helped save his son. He was beginning to see the woman herself. And neither of them yet realized how much that recognition would alter the course of both their lives. A week later, the kingdom gathered inside the grand royal hall. Snow still covered the capital beyond the towering windows, but sunlight now poured across the marble floors, filling the chamber with warmth and light. Nobles, advisors, healers, merchants, and palace staff stood shoulder to shoulder beneath crystal chandeliers, all waiting for the announcement that had been whispered about for days. Claire had no idea why she had been summoned. She stood quietly near the back of the hall, wearing the same simple blue dress she reserved for special occasions. The attention surrounding her still felt unfamiliar. She wished she could disappear into the greenhouse and return to the peaceful certainty of her plants. Instead, hundreds of eyes filled the room. Then the massive doors opened. Silence swept through the crowd. The Alpha King entered accompanied by his son. A ripple of emotion moved through the hall immediately. The young pup looked healthy once more. Color had returned to his face. His smile appeared bright and natural as he walked beside his father. For many people, seeing him well again felt like a miracle. The Alpha King guided his son toward the front of the chamber before stepping onto the raised platform. For several moments, he simply observed the gathering. Then he spoke. There are times when a kingdom learns something important about itself. His voice carried effortlessly throughout the hall. Every conversation ceased. Every eye focused on him. Sometimes we discover courage in unexpected places. Sometimes wisdom arrives from those we overlook. Claire felt her stomach tighten. A strange feeling told her she knew exactly where this was going. The Alpha King continued. When my son became ill, the finest healers in the kingdom answered my call. They worked tirelessly. They gave everything they could. Several physicians lowered their heads respectfully. Yet the answer came from someone many people failed to see. Slowly, the Alpha King's gaze moved through the crowd until it found Claire. The entire hall seemed to turn toward her at once. Her breath caught. Claire Parker. The sound of her name echoing through the royal hall felt unreal. The Alpha King extended his hand. Please come forward. A pathway immediately opened through the crowd. Claire could feel hundreds of eyes following her as she crossed the chamber. Her hands trembled slightly. When she finally reached the platform, she stopped several feet away from the ruler. The Alpha King looked at her with quiet respect. Not gratitude alone. Respect. You asked questions others ignored. His voice softened. You showed courage when it would have been easier to remain silent. Claire struggled to find words. The Alpha King continued. Most importantly, you cared about a child when many others were focused only on solving a problem. Silence filled the hall. Then the young pup stepped forward unexpectedly. Smiling, he held out a small winter flower that had recently begun blooming in one of the palace gardens. Claire recognized it immediately. She had planted it herself months earlier. Emotion tightened her throat as she accepted the flower. The Alpha King looked out across the gathering. Let it be known throughout this kingdom that true worth is not determined by rank, title, or birth. His gaze returned to Claire. It is determined by character. The hall erupted into applause. Nobles, servants, guards, healers. For the first time in her life, nobody was looking at Claire as a wolfless omega. They were seeing the woman she had always been. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently beyond the palace windows, while sunlight illuminated the kingdom below. And as Claire stood beside the Alpha King and the child she helped save, she realized something extraordinary. The life she had known was over. A new chapter had just begun.